Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Skylar. I'm a certified dog trainer and pet nutritionist. While I was scrolling through Instagram, I saw a headline from People magazine: viral emotional support alligator Wally is denied entry to the Philadelphia Phillies game. Naturally, as this headline was intended to do, I stopped in my tracks and wanted to know more about Wally the emotional support alligator. Not just because that sounds a little insane to the average person, but also because as a dog trainer, I get a lot of questions about emotional support animals, service animals, and therapy animals. I thought this would be a fun way of combining all of these topics together to make a hopefully very informative video for you guys. When I went to do more information on Wally the emotional support alligator, I found a People magazine article with the headline, "Wally the alligator is an unlikely emotional support animal who helps kids with disabilities." Not as fun of a headline as the Phillies game option, but this one's definitely much more wholesome and tells us a little bit more about Wally. Wally, the emotional support alligator, was rescued back in 2014 by Joey Henney, who helped to raise him, hand feed him, and created a really strong bond with this alligator. According to the article, after a couple of months, Joey started taking Wally, this emotional support alligator, to schools and senior centers as an educational tool, but quickly discovered that kids, especially kids with developmental disorders, would really gravitate towards Wally. Because of this, Wally's handler decided to seek an emotional support animal certification, and that's kind of how we got to where we are now. While this story is super wholesome and sweet, and I'm very happy for Wally, he seems like he has a very important job these days, it brought up some questions and some common misconceptions when it comes to working animals. So we're gonna take this as an opportunity to kind of explore the differences between service animals, emotional support animals, and therapy animals, as well as the registrations and requirements of each. So first, let's address that first headline. The super clickbaity, made for media, "My emotional support alligator was not allowed into a Phillies game." First of all, emotional support animals don't have to be dogs, they don't have to be cats. The requirements of what is considered an emotional support animal are much more varied than what is available as a service animal, for example. This means that yes, if an alligator brings you personally emotional support, that can qualify as an emotional support animal. This, however, doesn't mean that he would have been allowed in a Phillies game regardless. Unlike service animals, emotional support animals are not necessarily allowed in public spaces. The title emotional support animal doesn't grant them those same permissions. Emotional support animals can be pretty much any animal. They don't require any particular training, and they're often used for people who find emotional support in having that animal, and it helps to improve their overall mental and emotional well-being. Additionally, in the article, it talks about how Wally's guardian decided to seek an emotional support animal certification, registration, etc. Whatever terminology you want to use. In order to register your animal as an emotional support animal, you typically go to your family doctor, who will then often refer you to a trained counselor, psychologist, or psychiatrist, and this is used to prove that this particular animal brings you emotional support and is important to your overall mental and emotional well-being. That's really the only requirement for being an emotional support animal. There's no particular training involved, and you really just need a note from your doctor, counselor, psychiatrist, or licensed therapist in order to prove this. Having a prescription, for lack of better term, for an emotional support animal is really helpful in places that typically don't allow animals or have pet fees involved with having an animal in your home. That can make it harder for people that benefit from emotional support animals to seek those housing options. So essentially, if you have an emotional support animal, different housing options that wouldn't typically allow animals now do, and oftentimes if they include a pet rent or something like that, then those fees no longer apply. There are a couple of online programs or online organizations that advertise emotional support certifications. Pay X amount of money and you can have your emotional support animal. Or they'll tout different misinformation of take your pet anywhere, pay $300 to register them as an emotional support animal. And unfortunately, for the most part, these are scammy at best. Some of these programs might have counselors or other mental health professionals behind them that are able to do a similar thing that your doctor or counselor or therapist would be able to anyway. So if you have trouble getting access to those things, I suppose that's a potential option, but just know it's not necessary and there really isn't a registration or certification for emotional support animals. However, emotional support animals can't go in most public places, they cannot be taken everywhere, and they do not have the same rights as a service animal. Now, according to the article I read, it sounds like Wally's responsibilities actually lean more towards therapy animals. While service animals and emotional support animals are used for the individual, therapy animals are often used to help benefit others. Oftentimes, therapy animals are required to have specific training, especially if they're going to be going into schools, senior centers, hospitals, or courtrooms. The length of this specific training is really dependent on the organization that you're working alongside, the trainer you're working alongside, and where you're hoping to take those animals. But generally, doing a program similar to the American Kennel Club Canine Good Citizenship programs is a really great place to start. In fact, I've had a handful of dogs go through my Canine Good Citizen programs and have used that as the jumping off point to then start being registered therapy animals themselves. Most therapy animals are required to have training, but not necessarily specified tasks. So while a service animal might do things like retrieve medication, steady handlers that need a little help with mobility, or other very specific tasks, generally therapy animals are trained more in things relating to people, being calm around people, not taking food from people, things that are required of a very well-behaved animal by our society's standards, but don't necessarily have to lean themselves to a very specific purpose, a very specific job. Therapy animals also do not have the same rights as service animals. They can't just be taken anywhere, they don't have free reign of public spaces, and they're only allowed to work in a therapy setting in spaces that have allowed them. So for example, if you want to take your therapy animal to go hang out with older people in a retirement home, you need approval from that home. If you want to take your dog to go visit people in the hospital, you need approval from that hospital and whatever regulations they require of therapy animals that come to visit. If you want to take your dog to help support people going through court, you need to get permission from the court themselves and meet any additional requirements that they may have. Last but not least, this brings us to service animals. In order for your pet to qualify as a service animal, you need to do a few different very specific and important things. The very first one, you absolutely have to be disabled. This is non-negotiable for a service animal. Service animals are protected under ADA law, and in order for that to apply, you have to have a disability that affects and impacts your overall life. That could be a mental disability, it could be a physical disability. At the end of the day, service animals are essentially a medical tool that helps assist you in your day-to-day life. And if you don't feel like that applies to you, then you may not qualify for a service animal. Number 2, service animals do have to go through a ton of training. Not only do they have to have really great manners, they also have to be able to work in crowds, work around distractions, and have very specific task training. That's another non-negotiable requirement of a service animal. They have to have very specific tasks that assist you with your disability. These tasks can be anything from deep pressure therapy and medication retrieval to being used as a mobility aid for people who are blind or a little uneasy on their legs. Because service animals are protected under ADA law, they are allowed to be in public spaces that don't typically allow animals. They're allowed in restaurants, they're allowed in concerts, and yes, they're allowed in the Philadelphia Phillies Stadium. Additionally, businesses are allowed to ask you 2 questions about your service animal. The very first one is this a service animal? The second question they're allowed to ask is in relation to what tasks your service animal is trained in. They aren't allowed to ask you about why you have a service animal, what conditions you have, what disability you have, but they are allowed to verify that your animal is a service animal by asking about the tasks they are trained in. In short, service animals require lots and lots of training, are required to have a disabled guardian that they are helping, must have specific tasks that they are trained for in order to help with that disability. They are allowed in public spaces that do not normally allow animals. An emotional support animal does not need specific training, is more open to interpretation, breeds and species of animals that can qualify for this, and bring emotional and mental support to the person that they are helping. Also can, void pet fees or be allowed in places, housing situations that wouldn't typically allow animals. Emotional support animals, however, are not allowed in public spaces, and you don't have to go through an expensive online registration program for your animal. And finally, therapy animals are for the benefit of others. They do require a lot of training, but don't require any specific tasks like a service animal does. But depending on where you're planning on taking your therapy animal, they might have different standards or regulations that you'll have to follow. I hope you found this video helpful as a general overview of the differences between service animals, emotional support animals, and therapy animals. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave those in the comments below, and they may inspire a future video. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye!